So we've talked a little bit about the factors that courts would use when determining punitive damages, when the legal system thinks that it's appropriate. Let's talk about an economic rationale for punitive damages. So we talk about how if we provide full compensation to victims in that we bring them back to where they were, we make them whole, we actually provide the proper incentives for people to take the right amount of precaution. So if I make homemade wine during this coronavirus crisis and I decide to sell it, I see this as a profit opportunity, right? Ooh, people want to drink more homemade wine right now and I can make it. Let's sell it. If I sell it and I expect to cause, say, $4,000 worth of harm by people drinking my homemade wine and getting sick from it. Now, if I could take extra precaution with my winemaking and make it safer so people don't suffer that harm, proper incentives would say if it costs me less than $4,000 to avoid creating that harm of $4,000, then I should take those precautions, right? Now, if it costs me $5,000 to be safer when I make homemade wine and it's going to cause $4,000 worth of harm if I proceed anyway, we don't actually want me to take those precautions. There may be a question if we want me doing this at all. It depends how much benefit people get from drinking the homemade wine, comparing that to the $4,000 in harm, right? But we definitely don't want me taking $5,000 worth of precaution to prevent $4,000 worth of harms. That's not efficient. Now, if I can take $3,000 worth of precaution and prevent that $4,000 worth of harm, that's precaution we want me to take. And under a make whole standard, that works. So if someone gets sick from drinking homemade wine, it causes them $4,000 worth in harm, they sue me, I have to pay that $4,000. I'm going to be thinking about that when I'm deciding how much precaution to take. And if I can avoid that by taking $3,000 worth of precaution, making the wine in a safer way, I'm going to do it because it's better than this $4,000 harm that I'm going to have to pay for because of a lawsuit making the victim whole. So in that sense, our normal negligence standard works at providing the proper incentives. When could punitive damages come into play? Well, let's say many people who get sick don't know what caused them to be sick. So let's say only half the people who get sick from drinking homemade wine know that it's the homemade wine that made them sick. So only the people who know that the homemade wine make them sick are the ones who sue and get made whole in compensatory damages. Now, as I'm making homemade wine, I'm going to factor that in. If I create $4,000 worth of harm, but only half the people who get sick are going to sue me and I'm going to have to compensate them, then I only expect to have to pay $2,000 in damages to people. Because half the people who got sick never know what made them sick. And I'm getting away with it, kind of, right? So if it's $2,000 that I expect to pay out, again, if I could take that precaution for $3,000, I'm going to look at that and say, not worth it to be extra cautious making this wine. I'm going to just pay the $2,000 instead of the $3,000. So from a societal standpoint, that's inefficient. I'm creating $4,000 worth of harm. I could avoid it by taking $3,000 worth of precaution, but I'm deciding not to do it because I'm only going to have to pay out $2,000 because only half the people find out that the wine is what made them sick. And I only have to compensate the people who sue me, the ones who know it was the wine that made them sick. Now, in situations like this, where not everyone sues to be made whole for their injuries, that's when economics says we should use punitive damages to give people the proper incentives to take the right amount of precaution, the efficient precaution. So if half the people sue because they were harmed by homemade wine, we should actually tack on punitive damages equal to 1 over the probability of finding out. So in this case, if the probability is 0.5 that someone knows it was the wine that made them sick, we should multiply our compensatory damages by 2, 1 over 0.5, and that will give me as a winemaker the proper incentive to take efficient precaution in my wine production. So economic rationale says punitive damages can be a powerful tool at adjusting the incentives to take precaution. And specifically, when people don't know what caused their harm, or they're unlikely to sue based on the harm, then we should tack punitive damages on to give tortfeasors, people who are potentially harming others, proper incentives to factor in the damage they're causing and weighing it against the efficient precaution level to take. So the economic rationale is all about the probability of having to compensate victims, whether that's because they don't know what caused it or because they decide it's not worth it to go ahead with lawsuits. And there are mechanisms like class action lawsuits that are trying to make it easier for people who are injured in small ways, but there are a lot of them, to aggregate and be able to help make it more likely that the tortfeasors will have to pay compensation. But so from an economic standpoint, that's really what motivates our use of punitive damages. Now this lines up to some degree with the factors that courts consider when they're looking at punitive damages. If someone is engaging in this activity a lot, if they are making a lot of money from it, those are factors that get to this idea of, well, they may be kind of going ahead anyway because they can get away with it a lot of the time, right? And again, punitive damages can kind of force them to factor that in when they're thinking about precaution. The economic rationale doesn't perfectly line up with this idea of negligence, reckless, knowing, intentional, right? And that punitive damages are for reckless or more. There's a correlation between not knowing the probability of having to compensate victims and these different mental states, but it's not anywhere near a perfect correlation. So there is some disconnect between the legal system and what economic theory says should happen here.